Hey YouTube, welcome to another episode of Get in the Car. Now before we get into this episode, if you're not subscribed, drop a sub because I make videos like this pretty often and they're pretty fun. And if you are subscribed, unsubscribe. No, just kidding. Anyway, today's episode is going to be about one of my various hobbies that I have. One of those things that I really love doing is playing NES Tetris. This is like classic Tetris for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. So I really love classic Tetris. It's one of those things that I could just spend hours a day playing, and there's also a really big competitive scene around it. I'm not particularly competitive, but I do love watching tournaments and stuff like that. It's super cool. It's a really wholesome community, really great stuff. If you do want to see me play Tetris, I have a video where I got my first max out in NES Tetris. I've since gotten one more that I didn't upload, but the first one was obviously the most exciting. But one thing you might not know is that I almost had no way at all of playing NES Tetris. And that's the story I want to talk about today. So when I was a kid, I was a really big Nintendo fan. I grew up playing like pretty much every Mario game, got into like Zelda, Kirby, all sorts of stuff like that. And I grew up in the era of like the Wii and DS, so we had some pretty modern games at that point. And I did have those consoles, but there was something about classic NES Nintendo games that I just always loved. I remember as a kid at one point I found this probably illegal website where you could play an emulated version of Super Mario Bros. 3, and I just thought it was the coolest game ever. I was immediately obsessed with it. Eventually I also ended up buying some NES games on my Wii. They used to have the Wii Shop channel back in the day where you could pay like $5 and get like an NES game. So I had a lot of classic games on my Wii. And then also a close friend of mine, she had an NES that was like her parents' console when they were growing up, and she had like dozens and dozens of NES games. So whenever I would go over to her house, we would just spend hours playing that NES, and it was the coolest thing ever. So naturally, as a kid at around 10 or 11 at this point, I really wanted an NES of my own. I could play NES games on my Wii or on weird websites, but there's just something special about having the actual original hardware that I just, was really drawn to. So I guess I brought this up to my parents, and at some point, my mom had a memory from the late 80s or early 90s. So she remembered that she and her sisters had found out that there was a Jeopardy video game for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And my grandparents, my mom's parents, they loved Jeopardy. It was a constant staple in the house. They always had Jeopardy on at night. And so my mom and her sisters thought it might be a good idea to get this Jeopardy game for my grandparents. This has always seemed like a really funny situation to me. Like, it's not parents getting a game console for their kids, it's kids getting a game console for their parents. And also my mom and her sisters were already grown up at this point. Like, they weren't kids anymore. I don't think they were living at home or anything. Like, my grandparents at the time were in their 50s or 60s. They had never touched a video game before. They had no idea what an NES was or any of this stuff. But believe it or not, my mom and her sisters went through with it, and not only did they buy Jeopardy for my grandparents, but they bought an entire NES for them to play it on. It just seems like kind of a crazy concept to me, but that's what happened. So when I was 10 or 11, I found out about this from my mom, and immediately my new life goal was to find that NES. Because as the story goes, my intuitions are right. My grandparents were not particularly interested in the NES. Maybe they took it out and tried playing Jeopardy like once or twice, but it didn't become a household staple like watching Jeopardy was. But at the same time, my mom, her sisters, my grandparents, none of them could remember throwing out the NES or anything like that, or selling it. Obviously, at the time, it's a pretty significant piece of technology. It's not just the sort of thing like, a gift you don't like, you just throw it out or whatever. And they couldn't remember finding anybody to give it to or sell it to, so they probably still had it somewhere. But keep in mind, this was early 90s, so people in my family had, changed houses a lot, and the NES hadn't been used in decades at this point, so who knows where it could have ended up. But there was still that glimmer of hope that this NES could exist somewhere in someone's house, So my first move was, with my grandparents' permission, basically to ransack their attic, looking everywhere for this NES. So I went up to my grandparents' attic, looked through pretty much everything they ever had, and that NES was nowhere to be found. I'm pretty sure this was when I found their old typewriter, which they actually let me keep, so I did get some cool old tech out of it, but I didn't get an NES. Just a casual reminder to all the viewers, if you have grandparents and they have an attic, you should totally look through it sometime with their permission, because you might find something really cool. But anyway, I didn't find an NES, but my grandparents had moved in that time. They were in a new house at this point. And my aunt seemed to remember that maybe she had taken the NES when they moved, or, that she had taken some stuff from them when they moved. So it could be with her. So my next course of action was to check my aunt's attic. So I went up there with her and we looked around, we were digging through everything trying to find it, and, just absolutely nothing. No hit, no NES anywhere to be found. At this point, I had pretty much, lost all hope of finding it. Like, we had checked all the likely places it could be. It seems like it's just the sort of thing that was probably lost to time, and we'll never get it back. So I was pretty disappointed about that, but I moved on with an NES-less life. Fast forward a couple years to my 14th birthday. So we were having like a family celebration at my parents' house for my 14th birthday, and it came time to open up some gifts. And shockingly enough, I opened up a box, and inside was the NES! With Jeopardy! It was there. It wasn't lost to time. Somehow it existed. So I'm pretty sure I cried tears of joy when I saw it. This was like the best thing ever. I was so excited to have this NES. And so as it turns out, my aunt had been like cleaning out her attic or something, and she just happened to come across the NES. I guess it was in some spot we didn't look in. And I'm sure she wanted to tell me about it right away, but I guess my birthday was coming up, so she decided to save it for then. And like, boy oh boy, that was like the best birthday present ever. It was so cool. And because my grandparents pretty much never used it, the NES looked flawless, like basically perfect condition, brand new. So this was super exciting. And it had Jeopardy and the original Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, which was also, you know, a great bonus. So I, as the proud new owner of an NES, decided that it would probably be a good idea to get some extra games for it. You know, I only had 2 games for it that came with it. So I remember looking on eBay and I found a couple used NES games that were really cheap. I found NES Tetris, which I was like, I've always liked Tetris, why not give that a shot? And I remember I found Pinball too, which was pretty cool. So at the time, I remember playing NES Tetris with some of my friends when they would come over, and you know, I always enjoyed it, but I never got super into it or anything. And so after that, the NES kind of sat there for a while. You know, it was one of my proudest possessions, but it's not the sort of thing that I would play like every day, you know? But then later on, when I was maybe like 18, I came across a video of the Classic Tetris World Championships, and I thought it was so cool. And I kind of got interested in the Classic Tetris community and just the whole competitive scene around it, and like, you know, people who are actually really good at the game. And wouldn't you know it, by some stroke of luck and randomness from earlier in my life, I just happened to already have an NES with Classic Tetris, so I had a setup for playing this game. So when I was around 18 or 19, after watching a lot of competitive Tetris, I decided to actually play it, and I didn't need to pay anything to do it. I had all the supplies right there. And the rest is history. Now I am an amateur, mediocre NES Tetris player. And honestly, if I were just a Classic Tetris watcher and I didn't have an NES already, I probably wouldn't have had the motivation to go out and buy a whole NES and Tetris to play it. So I'm really glad that it was just sitting around there, because it, you know, made for a hobby that I really cherish now. Anyway, I arrived at my destination forever ago, so question of the day is, what's a thing that you have that you will never get rid of? I'm normally not a very materialistic person. I like to not have too many random things lying around, but my NES is something that I love so much, and I will absolutely never get rid of it for the rest of time. So let me know in the comments what the equivalent of that is for you. What's something you would never get rid of, no matter what? Anyway, that's about it for this episode of Get in the Car, so now it's time for me to get out of the car. Thanks for watching.